Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome back, and I think we'll just move straight on to the next section within hearing session 2, dealing with cumulative impact. So I have a number of questions under this heading, and we picked an opportune moment yesterday just to kind of pause things so we could look at this with fresh eyes today. So starting off with question 17. I'm directing this at the applicant first, really just trying to understand what viewpoints were key to understanding the cumulative impact. And by that, I mean the landscape and visual impact of the project. So could I ask Ruth Morrison to comment on that, please?
Well, just before that I wondered, we were talking about this earlier, and we wondered if perhaps questions 17 and 18, that there is I mean, I can understand why they're set out in the way they are, but there is a degree of overlap with them, and again we thought it might be helpful to take them both together rather than
yeah, that'd be fine. I mean, what I was expecting probably was when I asked question 17, and when I asked Dr. Wimble to respond, I was expecting him to then to probably go into the points under 17 and under 18, sorry, anyway. So it was really just there to catch that, just in case that specific question didn't come out. So let's just see how the responses come forward, and if I need to ask specifically number 18, I will do. Okay.
Thank you.
Ms. Morrison.
Thank you. Well, as outlined in our landscape and visual impact assessment, we don't consider that there will be cumulative impacts from the developments that we looked at. The developments were identified through the scoping stage of work, liaised with Highland Council and SNH over the developments to be considered. The developments were updated prior to the finalisation of the EIAR and the LVIA. As part of that, we looked at a number of different developments, and we considered that due to a variety of factors, primarily lack of intervisibility or timings, there wouldn't be cumulative impacts on either the landscape character or on visual amenity. I realise that Dr. Wimble considers that we were remiss in not looking at what he considered a scenario 1 form of assessment of cumulative impacts. We at no point during any of our discussions through the application, of which there were many with the consultees, statutory consultees, hasn't been raised as a criticism by the landscape officer at Highland Council, or indeed in either of the 2 reports from the planning officer. It also wasn't identified during either of the discussions with committee members, and hasn't been identified as a reason for the objection raised. We followed, as I mentioned in yesterday's brief discussions we had in question 2, that we followed the guidelines for landscape and visual impact assessment consistently. In paragraph 7.5 in GLVIA, it identifies clearly that it's important to be consistent across the EIA. This is something we have been. It also identifies that it must be reasonable and proportionate, and agree from the outset your approach with the statutory consultees, all of which we have done as part of our cumulative assessment. All of the existing schemes within the 5-kilometre study area and beyond, when it comes to a Far wind farm, which is visible from viewpoint 2, are identified as features within our baseline and have influenced the judgments on sensitivity of the landscape receptors and visual receptors where appropriate. GLVIA in paragraph 7.3 notes that tall structures, because of their height, like wind farms, require a different approach. However, as we discussed yesterday, this pump storage hydro scheme is not a tall structure like a wind farm, doesn't share the same extent of visibility, which is further determined in our ZTV on figure 11.6, which shows the limits of visibility from the development. We will come on, no doubt, to the viewpoints where Dr. Wimble considers that there are cumulative impacts as a result of considering the baseline schemes, such as the overhead line and some of the wind farms, which in many cases are over 20+ kilometers away. There are many areas of different landscape character between the development and these wind farms. And indeed, as presented on Dr. Wimbaugh's figure, showing the 30-kilometer study area with the different developments shown on that, there is very clear separation between our development, the development in question, and the series of wind farms that form an arc really on the much higher ground, the monolith stretching round to the northeast. Hydro schemes that are also identified in this much larger study area are very much historic in the sense that they form part of the landscape and have done since really the 1950s and 60s for the majority of them, Glendo being the exception, 2009. But again, there simply isn't the intervisibility between these projects and the Red John project. Not only are they at some distance from the project and significantly out with our study area, there's intervening landscape and topographical form that provides such separation that they simply are not experienced together. The overhead line that's been talked about at some length that falls within the study area and lies just to the immediate east of the head pond, extends across one of the landscape character types and is apparent in certainly viewpoints 4, 5 and 6 in particular. However, the development will not change the setting to that overhead line. It will still be seen against the context of forestry and landform in those views. And indeed the project, its connection to the grid will be by way of an underground cable, and so we will not be exacerbating the wirescape that could be considered by any introduction of an additional transmission line. So really in summary, we, in response to your question 17, we considered all the viewpoints in relation to the cumulative developments that we looked at. In relation to the baseline developments that Dr. Wimbaugh is going to be identifying, it's only the more elevated viewpoints that you have any experience of the wind farms. And with the overhead line, as I've already mentioned, it's viewpoints 4, 5 and 6. However, we looked at all of our receptors, both landscape and visual, when we consider the cumulative assessment in our LVIA.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Wimbaugh.
Yes, well, quite to know where to begin. I think the main point, which I may have made already, is that I felt the cumulative assessment, such as it was in the EIAR, had really kind of missed the point in terms of what developments are actually changing the landscape and what developments actually relate in function to the pump storage hydro. And my second point really is that I'm mainly concerned about cumulative effects on views rather than on landscape areas. So, and that boils down to a number of specific views, which in fact, Ms. Morrison has mentioned some of them. And there are two reasons why I decided to undertake this cumulative assessment. One was what I've described, what I felt to be the actual related projects that could usefully be subjected to a cumulative assessment. And the second is that in the viewpoints that have been discussed, the elevated viewpoints, which are in fact mainly 2, 4, 5, 6 and 7, either the electricity line and or Far wind farm are mentioned as features of the view. So although some of these, although Far wind farm is quite far away from some of the viewpoints, it nevertheless is prominent enough to be mentioned in the description of the view, and has also been commented on, as has the electricity line, as something that detracts from the view and therefore reduces the sensitivity or the quality of the view and therefore its sensitivity. So I feel that if these features are prominent and distinctive enough to be mentioned in that way, they are certainly suitable to be subject to a cumulative assessment. And as I explained yesterday, I don't think it's double counting, because a cumulative assessment assesses a different aspect, if you like, which is more about the development of the landscape or change in the landscape, especially incremental change to which new developments may add. And in this case, it's obviously the Red John Pump Storage Hydro. So perhaps I could go to the viewpoints, and if you could open up viewpoint 2, first of all.
Okay, just one moment.
And probably just the baseline photo, although actually it might be better to go to, say, year 1, because that's a bigger version, which you can see things more distinctively. Now, the description of this viewpoint specifically mentions Far wind farm in the background, and as a slight detracting element. Now, you'll see from THC1, if you have that by you as well, it's probably going to be useful. That Far wind farm is currently being expanded with more turbines, Glen Kailaki. Now, the electricity line is not particularly prominent in this view, and you certainly can't really see it in the photograph because it's half behind the landform, and it's certainly behind the landform of the head pond area. But it is something of a feature. So there are 2 features there that are related to energy generation and transmission that already characterize the view, being expanded in the case of the wind farm. That I'm not particularly sure about this viewpoint, but certainly in viewpoint 7, which we'll go to, you see other wind farms as well in the Monolea that are illustrated on THC1. So if we go to the next viewpoint, viewpoint 4, just the baseline photograph here to start off with. You'll see here that the electricity line spans most of the view, and if you scroll down to year 1, you'll see that the crest of the embankment is almost in parallel with the cables, with the conductors of the electricity line. So that's very much what we would call a simultaneous cumulative effect. And I think this would be most obvious during the construction period, where there's other bits of machinery in the view. Nevertheless, I made my comments yesterday about what I felt to be the artificiality of the landform. So bear in mind that that might continue to be seen as development rather than just a bit of natural landscape. Either way, they both add together and certainly in the earlier stages, Red John would be a significant addition to energy infrastructure in that view. If we go then to viewpoint 5, again here you see the electricity line just spanning the gap in the trees, as will, if you go down to year 1, the head pond will partially do so as well. So again, that's what we'd call a simultaneous cumulative effect. Now, viewpoint 6 doesn't really show most of the cumulative infrastructure that I mentioned in my statement. However, the electricity line does pass below the foot of the hill and then passes across the landscape by the site. And I think from here, although it may not be obvious in the image, other electricity lines are seen in the background. So again, going to viewpoint 1, sorry, year 1 rather, year 1 of viewpoint 6, you see both the head pond and the electricity line simultaneously. However, if you are to turn around, and this is what we call a successive cumulative effect, you can see close to you, within about 8 kilometers, Dumnaglas wind farm, which is being consented for expansion. You can see Far wind farm a little further away. Look further north, you can see Moy wind farm, which is actually set between 2 hills. And I believe on the day I saw Corrigarth wind farm as well. So you can see at least 4 wind farms plus the electricity transmission infrastructure plus Red John, all from that site. So you are very much in the middle of an energy production and transmission landscape. And then the final view, viewpoint 7, probably best just to go to year 1. You can see, probably not very clearly unless you really blow it up, but certainly from the site, from the viewpoint, you can see electricity lines spanning across the landscape. I think you can see against the light reflection of Loch Duntelchick, you can see the electricity line, you can see the towers anyway, dotted across the landscape. You can see Far wind farm, obviously in the background. If you go right to the left, so if you go to the left of the picture, i.e. further north, you can see Moy wind farm lying between the hills. It's in a sort of, quite unusual for a wind farm, a sort of valley setting. And I think if the photograph extended further south, i.e. to the right, you would be able to see Dumnaglas. And remember, these wind farms are also, these 2 wind farms are also being extended. As a point of interest, you can also turn round and see what I think must be one of the wind farms to the west of viewpoint 7, possibly Fairburn, but obviously not in this picture. but the main concern really is what you see simultaneously with the site. So now it's a matter, obviously, for you to judge as to how much you think these cumulative effects are important. But I think what I've at least highlighted is that there is ongoing change in the landscape to which the development will contribute. And from some of the viewpoints, it's quite clear that you can see many developments at once.
Thank you, Dr. Wimble. Ms. Morrison, would you like to comment on what Dr. Wimble said?
Yes, please. I think it's important to remember that to have a feature in the view doesn't necessarily mean there'll be a cumulative effect. These developments that Dr. Wimble's talking about are quite different in form, in the way that they're going to appear in the view, and visually look quite different, and people are not going to immediately associate that there is a similarity in function, as he's suggesting, between the wind farm and the Red John development, which is primarily a water body set within a wooded landscape. I'd like to look at the views again that Dr. Wimble's just talked through. So viewpoint 2, where Far Wind Farm is visible, the overhead line you would really have to be looking for to be able to actually see it in the view. It's certainly not prominent, it's certainly not a characteristic feature of the view. Loch Ness very much is, and Far Wind Farm is seen very much on the backdrop of the view at some distance. And again, obviously, depending on visibility with all of these elevated views, it's a visibility in the climatic conditions that differentiates on the extent that they may or may not appear as features or prominent features within the view. Certainly Far Wind Farm's not a prominent feature. Glenkillicky, it's under construction at the moment, so it is under construction and therefore appearing and will be appearing as part of Far Wind Farm against very much a backdrop of the view. And the development is not going to be seen in association with that. There are multiple landscape character types that provides visual separation as well as obvious physical separation from the Red John development and these wind farms in question. And even if you were to consider and take this baseline wind farm into consideration from this viewpoint, the characteristics of this view cumulatively are not going to have any significant cumulative impact. They appear as quite different features within the view and in different parts of the view in terms of the sense of your immediate foreground, midground and background of the view. In viewpoint 4, where the overhead line is visible and in the view, there's no question about that. But what I would disagree with Dr. Wimble about is that its context will change. So the overhead line is seen very much against a backdrop of forestry. The towers in some instances still skyline. That won't change, and in fact in one of the views they'll skyline slightly less one of the towers as a result of the backcloth of some of the head pond embankment. But fundamentally, the setting to the overhead line won't change. Its appearance in the landscape will remain as is, with a backdrop of forestry, woodland, and with landform. I can understand there could be a cumulative change as suggested by Dr. Wimble if, for example, the backcloth of forestry and landform was removed and that you therefore had that appearance of the line skylining fully and appearing against a very different backcloth. But that simply isn't happening at all. So that's from viewpoint 4. Viewpoint 6, I mean, it's a panoramic viewpoint. Again, it very much depends on clarity and weather conditions, the extent you see. You certainly get fantastic views which extend for, many kilometres, of which there are many different features within that. You see Inverness out to the Beauly Firth. You have sweeps round of the mountainous landscape, and certainly the wind farms that are presented by in the figure, the 30-kilometre figure by Dr. Wimble, suggests this arc of development, which is, you can see why it's been, why you have wind farms in these locations. It's very much in an upland context, at a distance, away from Loch Ness, and very much on the monolith band that stretches up. Moy, as Dr. Wimble said, of course, it's still within that arc of development, although not on the higher reaches of land. The overhead line, again, is not going to change its context, so it's going to be seen within the same landscape type. The features are going to remain the same in the sense of the proportion of forestry and woodland. Its relationship to the landform similarly will be exactly the same. And the other overhead line developments that have been identified are very much in the distance of the view. You again have to be really kind of searching them out. The overriding characteristics are ones of water bodies, of this relationship of woodland, forestry, moorland and water, rather than the more distant overhead line features in the view. And as I mentioned before, the development isn't exacerbating any wirescape and additional overhead line features within the landscape. It's an underground cable, so that it avoids any additional influence that could be considered in terms of the wirescape. And viewpoint 7, again, another panoramic view of which there are many features that are within it. We talked about yesterday, I don't think Dr. Wimble or I disagree on the point that there won't be significant effects at year 15, and that you are at quite a distance from the development, and you're at an even greater distance from the wind farms that are discussed over 20 kilometres from that point, and certainly upwards of that. And they appear as part of that very much an element of a wider landscape. And I would dispute the thought, the suggestion that you would be in any of these viewpoints sitting within this energy transmission generation landscape. That would suggest that you were amongst a dense development surrounded by wind farms at a closer proximity, transmission lines abounding, and all of these viewpoints, these features are distant. With the respect of the immediate overhead line, it sits certainly in a lower position in the majority of these elevated views. So there's not the sense of an overwhelming energy-driven landscape that the Red John development is going to cumulatively affect in the way that's being suggested. And indeed, in Dr. Wimble's hearing statement, he concludes that he considers that the effects identified on the landscape and on views other than the 3 viewpoints that we discussed yesterday, he's in agreement with our assessments.
Dr. Wimble, do you have anything further you want to add?
Yes, there's a few points that have come up there. I mean, again, I would reiterate that I feel if you like, the subject area that I've chosen for the cumulative assessment is more relevant than the developments that were chosen for the environmental impact assessment. And now I understand that those were agreed with consultees, etc. So I'm very much coming in with my own observations as a fresh pair of eyes on this, and obviously with quite a lot of experience of having dealt with cumulative assessment. So that's the first point I'd make. The second point I would just like to reiterate again about visibility, climatic conditions, darkness, etc. We undertake all our assessments on the basis of good visibility. We obviously understand that that's not the case all the time, but we don't let that factor intervene in undertaking the assessment of visual effects, which is, I suppose, called the maximum or worst case scenario. Now, a lot has been said about various things being distant and not prominent. Can I take you to the environmental impact assessment, chapter 11, and the description?
Just 1 second.
It's the description of viewpoint 2, the sensitivity assessment. So paragraph 11.464.
11.464.
Yes. On electronic page about 441.
Okay.
So if in fact you scroll down onto the next page and mention, I'm just seeing if far is mentioned to start with. I think it's on the next page, on page 1123. The background of the view comprises vast rolling uplands, turbines and access track of Far wind farm are noticeable on the skyline. So not so far that you can't immediately pick it up on a clear day. Secondly, the second to last sentence, however, forestry clearances and the presence of moving turbines at Far wind farm on the distant skyline partially reduce the overall scenic quality. And again, I think Far wind farm is mentioned in the context of viewpoint 7, Carnalitra, which is 11.469. And I mean, perhaps you can read yourself rather than spend too much time here, but the electricity line is noted as a detracting feature in viewpoint 4 and viewpoint 5, and it's noted as a feature from viewpoint 6. So these features are obviously mentioned. The more distant feature, Far wind farm, is mentioned as being noticeable and having an effect on the view. So to that extent, I feel justified in including that and other noticeable wind farms in carrying out a cumulative assessment. Can I also take you to guidelines for landscape and visual impact assessment?
Mm-hmm. And
particularly paragraph 717.
7.17 of GVR.
Yeah, page 123.
A second, it takes a little time to open this up. That's it.
It might be a different electronic page. So at the bottom of page 123, it will say types of cumulative effect.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. So again, I'm going to ask you to turn the page over, but it just says there are many types of cumulative landscape and visual effect that may need to be considered. They can include, and then there's a series of bullet points, mm-hmm. and I would take you to bullet points 2, 3, and 4, I think. So amongst types of cumulative effect, bullet point 2 at the top of page 124 says the filling of an area with either the same or different types of development over time, such that it may be judged to have substantially altered the landscape resource and views or visual amenity. Secondly, the interactions between different types of development, each of which may have different landscape or visual effects, and where the total effect is greater than the sum of the parts. And finally, incremental change. This is bullet point 4, incremental change as a result of successive individual developments, such that the combined landscape or visual effect is significant, even though the individual effects may not be, which is the 3 points that cover, I suppose, what I've been talking about is about incremental change in the landscape. And you can't just look at a development in isolation, which is obviously what happens when you write an environmental statement. You're mainly concentrating on that development. You have to take a wider view as to how it adds to change in the landscape. So first of all, I think you need to consider whether this is an issue, and secondly, whether the effects, which I think will probably mainly be significant in the early stages, although 1 or 2 stages later, whether those effects are actually of a material consideration.
Okay. I think we're touching on some of my later questions here, which is fine. So we'll cover that now. Actually, question 21 asks about your suggestion of ongoing and incremental change, which I think you've just touched on there. Ms. Morrison, would you like to respond to the points made by Dr. Wimble there?
Yes, thank you. So just following on in the paragraph 7.18 in GRVIA from the section that Dr. Wimble's just taken us through, it identifies that agreement should also be reached about whether the cumulative effects assessment is to focus primarily on the additional effects of the main project under consideration or the combined effects of all the past, present and future proposals. So we consulted over all of this, and it was determined that the approach we took was an appropriate and proportionate approach for the type of development that the application's about. It's not a wind farm, and we haven't followed wind farm guidance. It's been designed specifically for that, for the extent of visibility. And indeed, yesterday, Dr. Wimble even suggested that when you look at this, his figure extending to 30 kilometres, that the wind farms that are actually at the extent of the 20-30 kilometres have a very minor influence on the study area, our 5 kilometre study area. So taking that into account, even if we were to consider that we should have looked at, or it was appropriate to look at a scenario 1 of the baseline cumulative developments, it's very hard to imagine how these wind farm developments could have a bearing, and certainly no bearing of any significance on the visual receptors that we've been discussing. As you can see from the landscape and visual assessment analysis that you were taken to by Dr. Wimble, we identified these features as a noticeable element in the view. They are a characteristic of the baseline view, and that's been taken into account in our assessment. But you can have many characteristics in the baseline view from these representative viewpoints. They contribute to the quality of the view, often also influence the susceptibility to the development in question. And I reiterate again that the pump storage hydro development is very different in characteristics, in form, in the way it's going to be appeared within the landscape, and is not in any way similar to the types of wind farm development that are being considered. And again, the overhead line, I've already given the reasons why I consider that even if you were to look at that as a cumulative development in the scenario 1 baseline developments, that its setting and its appearance and the way it's characterized within the landscape doesn't change, and that the addition of the Red John development in combination with it certainly does not give rise to a significant cumulative impact.
Dr. Wimble, anything further?
Sorry, you mentioned question 21. Have we actually skipped to that, or do you still intend to come to that?
I can still come to that if you want me to ask that specifically, but you were dipping into that, I felt, when you answered your previous point.
Right, okay. Well, we'll see how we go anyway. So the 2 points I would raise, which I've probably raised several times, are one, there is a relationship in the function of these particular developments that I've highlighted in THC1 and in my table in a statement. So that's what I feel, if you like, separates them out from other developments. Secondly, these features have been noticed as characterizing some of the views, particularly the views where I've suggested there may be significant cumulative effects. So I feel, and I understand obviously that this was not highlighted at the time of the application. So really I feel it's a matter for you to consider further, but I feel certainly justified in raising it as a potential issue. I suppose the final point I would make, which we're probably going to come to in one of the later questions anyway, is the duration and amount of significant effects. And the point I would make there is I think that we're all agreed that there will be quite a number of significant effects for certainly the construction period and some of the operational period. And in that respect, we could be looking at perhaps 20 years of significant effects where Red John appears as an intervention in the landscape which is related to the wind farms and the transmission lines. I mean, the relationship between pump storage hydro, wind energy and transmission is highlighted early on in the application and the environmental statement as a key driver for developing pump storage hydro in the Highlands.
Ms. Morrison, do you want to come back on any of that, or shall I move us on if there's something you want to say?
I'm happy moving on, other than just to say that there's a relationship in function, but I would argue there's not a relationship in visual form and how it's then appeared within the landscape and in views.
Okay, just moving on to question 19, and I think we've probably covered some of this already, but I just wanted to clarify, because in the applicant's hearing statement, I think it was stated that it was the council's position that there were unlikely to be any cumulative landscape and visual effects of any consequence. But I think, if I understand it correctly, Dr. Wimble, that was made in the context of those developments that have been considered by the applicant. Am I correct in understanding that?
Yes, that's correct. I think it was, I'm trying to think what the developments were. One is the radio mast that's nearby to the site, which obviously doesn't have much of a relationship apart from being close to it and fairly prominent. Another was the pump storage hydro at the other end of the Great Glen, which, while it relates in function, it's so far away that you couldn't really have any significant cumulative effects. And I think another was a pipeline, which I suppose, if it happened during the construction period, would have some cumulative consequences. So yes, that's why I agreed that those developments didn't really lead to any significant cumulative effects.
Okay, it was on that basis. Ms. Morrison, could you just clarify the developments considered, and just if you have any comments in response to Dr. Wimble's comments there?
He's correct in the developments he's identified. There were other developments identified as part of the wider cumulative developments in the EIAR, and these are the developments that we scoped into the LVIA to consider. The only comment I do have is in Dr. Wimble's hearing statement, he agrees that there aren't cumulative impacts even considering these baseline schemes on landscape character, and the SLA as a result. So when looking at the initial reason for objection from the committee, it is primarily over landscape character and the SLA and the potential impacts on the SLA. So I don't think we're in disagreement over these potential cumulative effects, irrespective of whether you consider we've looked at the extended developments identified in the discussions we've had over wind, or indeed the developments we've considered.
Okay, Dr. Wimble?
Well, yes, what Ms. Morrison has referred to in the end about the effects on the landscape, clearly I've come to the conclusion that effects on the landscape per se in the long term, this is after year 15, are unlikely to be significant, which is partly related to the scale of the areas being considered compared with the area affected by the development. So therefore it's unlikely that there would be significant cumulative effects by the addition of the development. So that's why I haven't identified significant cumulative effects in the landscape, though I would make the point that we are agreed that earlier in the development stages, certainly during construction and probably during the early operation, landscape effects would be significant before the development mitigation features mature. So I suppose one could argue at that stage that there might be cumulative considerations, but it's not a matter that I considered much. I looked more at the long term.
Okay. Moving on to question 20, and I think we've touched on a lot of this already as well. I knew this was kind of probably happen. Table 1, which is in Planning Council's Dr. Wimble's hearing statement, lists larger energy infrastructure within 30 kilometres of the site boundary. What infrastructure does the Highland Council consider to be missing from the applicant's cumulative assessment? And I presume you're suggesting that all of that, or the ones that you've touched on today, although some of those are already mentioned in the baseline. So I just want to understand if you're suggesting that all of this should have been covered in some form in the assessment produced by the applicant.
Well, as I've already said, I'm not sure that a lot of these developments would interact, or that Red John would interact significantly with a lot of these developments. For the sake of completeness and transparency, decided to have a 30-kilometre cumulative study area because it included wind farms, and some of the wind farms that would be visible were at least 20 kilometres away from the site, although may not be significant would almost certainly not be significant on their own. They are a feature of the wider landscape seen on clear days. So that's why I've included those developments. I included hydro schemes because obviously they relate very closely in function and some in appearance to Red John, though I haven't really talked much at all in my statement about any cumulative effects with those, largely because they are not very visible. So that's essentially THC1. That's my explanation for including those developments.
Ms. Morrison.
Thank you. Just to confirm that within the second part of your question there, which the extent the infrastructure is covered in the baseline assessment or lies outside the 5-kilometre study area, well, all of the infrastructure is already covered in the baseline assessment or lies outside the 5-kilometre study area. So all the other developments other than the Foyers Essex overhead line are out with the 5-kilometre study area identified in Dr. Wimble's table 1, and all the wind farms are over 10 kilometres away. And I note that Dr. Wimble's just suggested that Red John won't interact significantly with a lot of these developments.
Okay. Dr. Wimble, anything further you want to say? Can I move us on to the next question?
Well, I think you can take it from me that the developments that I've included in my statement relating to the relevant viewpoints that we've discussed are the ones that I think may interact, that Red John may interact with cumulatively.
Okay. Okay, 21, we'll come back to this point about ongoing and incremental change in the landscape, and the suggestion that that should be given appropriate consideration in deciding whether or not to consent to proposed development. I suppose I'm just trying to understand how, Dr. Wimble, you see this being reflected in any recommendations that I make to Scottish ministers. Based on what you've said earlier, I'd just like to understand that in a little bit more detail.
Well, I think the Scottish ministers should obviously understand the landscape and visual effects of the development to their fullest extent. So we touched on yesterday about effects on individual receptors that have been alluded to but not detailed in any way. And then the second point really is that when consenting developments, they should consider overall change and the direction of change in the landscape. I mean, it may be that they consider this change as a positive, but there are probably many people, well, we know obviously there are some people that would consider this change as a negative, and obviously many people consider wind farms as a negative feature in the landscape. So I think it's important at least to consider what's happening in time and space in the wider landscape, and not just concentrate on the effects of the development and its immediate surroundings.
Ms. Morrison?
I think it's important to consider, when you're thinking about incremental and ongoing change in the landscape, to consider the key characteristics of those landscapes that could be changed, could be eroded, could be adversely affected by any incremental change. So when looking at the host landscape characteristics for the Red John site, it's a gently undulating moorland, woodland plateau, a series of lochs. There's large tracts of coniferous forestry plantation and woodland. There's a large-scale landscape where skylines predominantly horizontal in views. So when looking at the development in question, which is primarily a large water body integrated into the landscape through a manipulation of landform and extensive woodland planting, it's hard to see how that in itself is creating a particularly any negative incremental change, and certainly not one associated with the other incremental changes that are being suggested by the pattern of wind farm development within the much wider landscape. As already mentioned, the hydro schemes that are much more widely dispersed and are very much historic features in the landscape do not have a bearing on this study area or on the Red John development, and certainly aren't going to be read in any kind of relationship with it. So arguably the extensive and whole-scale change to the forestry that's currently there into the different types of native woodland planting, the holistic approach to this mitigation design, which allows for ecological benefit as well as improved recreational access and visual amenity associated with the changes in native woodland planting, are going to have a positive incremental change on the landscape character types that we're looking at. And this is further aligned with the SLA citation that identifies under its landscape enhancements. One of the factors is to look at the harder commercial forestry plantation edges and trying to design them and revise them in such a way that they sit more comfortably within the landscape and provide a more positive contribution to it. And that's where this extensive native woodland planting is going to have that benefit within not only the host landscape character types, but also from wider views towards that the landscape that the development is situated within.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Wimble, do you have anything further to add on that particular point, or are we...
No, I take the points that Miss Morrison is making. Obviously, we've been talking about cumulative impact with schemes of related function, but I understand that other aspects of the scheme to do with landform and woodland and how that relates to what's in the landscape as well. My only two comments on that would really be as to how well integrated the scheme turns out to be in the long term and how long it takes to achieve that level of integration.
Okay, thank you. I think that probably leads us nicely on to the final section in terms of mitigation and residual effects. But what I'm going to suggest is we just have a short break because we're progressing quite well and it's likely that we'll be finished by lunchtime now. So if we have a short break and then come back and conclude the final section. It's 10:30 just coming up to, so can we say 10:45, please, if you could be back then. Thank you. Hello, welcome back everybody. So we're moving on to the final section dealing with mitigation and residual effects. As I said at the start of today, there's three questions mainly into this, but there's also, I want to just touch on some of the conditions which relate to some of this as well. So as we go through, I might highlight the conditions that I want to discuss. Question 22, the assessment describes the long-term effects as 10 plus years, and I appreciate that can be a longer period than 10 years, it's 10 plus, but it gives the impression it's the effects are around that kind of roughly that time scale. So I just want to see how that corresponds with the 6 years of construction that's been indicated, and then the assessment that looks for up to year 15, which takes you well beyond 20 years in terms of assessment. Could I just direct that question to the applicant, please, to Ms. Morrison, as to how that consideration of long-term effects, whether we're really talking 20 plus years rather than 10 plus years in terms of effects. Ms. Morrison.
I think, thank you. I think it would be helpful for me to explain perhaps the difference between duration in terms of length of time, how that's influenced the assessment, and then the assessment scenarios, just for clarity. So landscape and visual magnitude of change is expressed as a number of factors: the size or scale of change, the geographical extent, and the duration and reversibility. And as identified in our Appendix 11.1, which is ILI 11.26, we set out the kind of time frames that we consider for the different extents of duration, of which we consider long-term to be 10 years or more. So the duration criteria considered in determining the magnitude of change, and that shouldn't be confused with the assessment phases, which are consistent across the EIAR as construction, operation, year 1, and then year 15. And I think this goes on to the next question, which I won't touch on yet, but about why we've got a year 15 assessment phase. So for each assessment phase, we've considered the duration as an element of magnitude in determining the overall effects and our judgments on that. So in that sense, during construction, we've considered the length of the construction period, and that's informed our judgments on magnitude. And similarly for our operational period and our year 15 period, we've looked at how duration is a component in the overall judgments of magnitude of change, and that combination with sensitivity for assessment of effect. It's perhaps helpful for me also to explain some of the construction period in terms of duration of it. In the SEI, which is ILI 12.01 on page 6, there's a table that quite helpfully colour codes the difference between the above ground construction works and below ground. And I think that's an important differentiation to make, because a large part of this development will be constructed underground and will not be visible. That's not to say that the above ground operations won't be. They'll be stretching from the enabling year 1 and have different phases and peaks really in their activity associated with the tail pond and head pond. But that quite clearly sets out with the differentiation and the extent that the full extent of construction activity it will be focused in periods within that time frame, and not a consistent emphasis throughout those 6 years. And in fact, latterly in the 6 years, it's about some of the tail pond elements being constructed, and obviously the testing and of the scheme prior to operation.
Yeah, just looking at that. So
I'll wait to not go on to answer question 23, although I recognise that they are related.
Yeah, Ms. Morrison, sorry, just looking at the figure 1 in page 6 of the SEI. So the construction phases tend to be. Can you hear me? Okay.
Sorry, Mum. We sort of lost you there.
Okay.
Yeah, we.
Okay. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but whilst I'm on air, so to speak, can I ask for the document reference that you've just looked at? Because I was struggling.
Yes, the SEI, and it's ILI.
Yeah, I think you'll have to go into that.
ILI 12.01.
So, sorry, Mum. I think a witness is going to have to go in and out of the system to try and get back in, because you're muted on her.
Oh, okay.
So there does seem to be an ongoing problem with Zoom. I had it this morning for about 5 minutes, where it, everyone goes mute from my side. Luckily, it was like I could hear the person who was speaking from another thing. So she's going to log out and come back in.
Okay, we'll let her go out and come back in. That's fine.
Yeah, no, that's what happened too. I think, Mum, that might get us back on.
Okay, Ms. Morrison, can you hear me okay?
I can. I'm sorry. It keeps saying that it's unstable, and I can't hear people very well. But I could hear you just then, so let's try and go with it.
Yeah. Let me know if you have any further problems though, because I'm not hearing. I'm not aware of the problems here, so I'm trying to pick up on the signals. Okay. The point I was just going to make. You directed me to figure 1, the construction program of the SEI, and that's ILI 12.01. Can you not hear me again?
Sorry, Mum. No, you've gone again, I'm afraid. We'll try something else. We might try and get another computer. I think it is a problem with Zoom rather than with anything else. We'll move around and get another computer going.
Oh well.
Certainly you're fine, I think, as far as Dr. Wimble and I are concerned.
Okay, all right.
Hi, I've swapped seats to see if that makes it easier for me to hear. Sorry, I couldn't hear anything earlier. So I've swapped with someone else. I'm now appearing as Robert Hewitt. I'm not sure if Callum wants to rename me or I can remain as is.
He can probably do that. Callum, would you mind doing that?
Yeah, I'll just get that done just now.
So I'm having a slight technical problem myself, but it's come back right, losing some of the documents.
How do you make it louder?
Okay. Thank you, Callum. Okay, I'll start again. It was just the document that you directed me to was the SEI and document 12.01, and it was figure 1, which is the construction programme. And I think you'd highlighted in there the underground and overground works, and your point that you made was that that's overground works certainly are not consistent over that whole 6-year period. I just wanted to home in a little bit. Can you hear me okay, Ms. Morrison? You can, good. Okay, just to home in a little bit. So just to take through my understanding. So overground works are shown in blue there, and the tail pond will commence first, continuing starting in year 1, continuing to the end of year 2. The head pond excavation and embankment works will start in year 2, continuing on, particularly the embankment will continue, and I presume the lining of that will come into year 3, concluding right through until the kind of 3rd period in year 5. And then I'm just looking at what else will be going on at the same time. At the same time, there'll be underground works coming in at year 2 and 3. So just to understand, so most of the underground works, as you said, will be taking place, although the 6-year period is indicated, there'll be fits and starts, I suppose it's best to say, in certain parts of the site where there'll be more focused activity, and the tail pond itself will be concluded by year 2, and it'll be majority of the works will be on the top and the head pond in years 2, 3 and 4. Is that a fair kind of assessment of what I can see from here?
Yes, it is. Some of the tail pond inlet outlet works will be appearing, as you can see, year 5. But otherwise, yes, that's a fair, full understanding of the spread of construction activity and the phasing of it.
The tail pond works towards the end there. I presume that's kind of the final connections with the remainder of the work that's being done in terms of the tunnelling that will come down and the point at which that will then connect up at the bottom, I presume.
Yes, and it's the actual intake outlet structure on the side of the lock as well that will be completed.
Okay. Right, thank you. It's just I wanted to understand that a little bit better. Dr. Wimble, do you want to say anything in relation to what Ms. Morrison said there about the long-term effects, the period of time of construction?
Can I go first of all to the table that we've just been discussing?
You can, yeah.
I want to make sure that I have understood and that you have understood where the activities that are likely to be noticed by people are actually taking place and for how long. So we've got all the pre-construction works for the first 18 months or so. So really you're talking a lot of activity there, a lot of change in the landscape in terms of tree removal, earthworks clearance and roads moving and so on. So that's a lot happening everywhere. Together with the tail pond, the temporary works is basically as I understand it, would be the cofferdam. So that's actually probably the largest single element of the tail pond works. And in the SEI, it shows the cranes and tugboats and so on that would work on that. And then you have head pond, which begins in year 2, and head pond excavation, but notice most of all, overlapping with all the site clearance works and so on, is embankment construction, and that is pretty much the last thing to finish. And remember, this will be tipping of bulk materials unmitigated by vegetation or screening, a lot of dozer and other activity. And then going down to removal of temporary works for the tail pond. Remember, that's 3 quarters taken with activity in Loch Ness, removing the cofferdam. So again, probably more high profile than any other aspect of that, of site works at the tail pond. So I would still say that at the upper part of it, everybody is going to be noticing either very extensive or prominent earthworks until almost the end of year 5, and in Loch Ness they're going to see a lot of activity in year 6, removing a lot of bulk fill material, as I understand it.
Thank you. Ms. Morris?
Yes, just a couple of things to clarify. The cofferdam is mainly underwater. There will be small sections of it that will be above water, but it's predominantly an underwater, subwater structure. I think it's important to note that there will be the advanced tree planting we talked about previously that will commence at the very start of year 1, or even indeed prior to year 1, as it's not going to be impacted by any of the construction activity or indeed the areas that will be felled as part of the forestry removal and the enabling work. So it's entirely separate areas where the advanced management of the native woodland we talked about yesterday, and also the additional large area of native woodland planting to the southwest of the site, as identified on ILI 9.95. Also, a lot of the bulk material isn't being removed. It will be used within the head pond construction of the head pond embankment and structure as a whole. So there won't be this mass removal of a lot of bulk material across the loch. So just wanted to clarify that point.
Dr. Wimble, anything further?
No, I understand the cofferdam is mainly underwater, simply that there must be some form of activity on the loch taking place. I'm not quite sure how the cofferdam is removed, where the material goes. Did I understand that would be taken up to the head pond area?
Ms. Morrison, could you clarify?
The cofferdam is lifted out, in effect. Its structure is lifted out from the water, and the material used in it will be used within the head pond structure embankment. Oh, sorry, just one moment. Sorry, I need to clarify that the cofferdam doesn't actually have material within it. It's sheet piling that will be lifted out and then removed from site.
Okay, so it'll actually be removed. Thank you. Just moving on to question 23, and you were going to touch on this, I think, Ms. Morrison, about the operational periods as year one. I just want to understand why those periods were chosen, and what the effects potentially are, significant effects are remaining after year 15. So could you answer those points, please?
Yes, certainly. The assessment periods are consistent across the EIAR, other than for the landscape and visual assessment. We've included an assessment period at year 15, and the purpose of that was to demonstrate how the mitigation planting would influence the views, and in terms of landscape character, how it would have an influencing factor on that. So it was to provide two scenarios through operation, in effect a worst case of year one of the scheme opening, and then to demonstrate how the planting is established by year 15. And year 15 has just become a bit of an industry standard. I think originally going down back to Design Manual for Roads and Bridges identified that as an appropriate period to consider the large scale, or certainly the effect that large-scale planting can have on a landscape and in views. So that's why we've chosen two periods to assess. So you can understand, so stakeholders could understand the effect the native woodland planting would have on views and on landscape character. The residual effects, there are no residual effects on landscape character or landscape designations. The only residual effects are from viewpoint 1 and from viewpoint 11.
That's landscape character effects, viewpoint 1 and viewpoint 11.
So just to clarify, there are no significant residual effects on landscape character or on landscape designations. The only residual significant effects are for visual amenity, are from viewpoint 1 and from viewpoint 11.
Didn't hear that right, thank you. Dr. Wimble, do you want to comment?
Well, I agree entirely with Miss Morrison that, as she says, the 1 year and 15-year period is an industry standard, and it's to allow assessment of mitigation measures that take time to develop, which is commonly planting.
Okay.
Obviously, the planting will carry on growing after 15 years, but 15 years is taken as a reasonable period of time over which to consider these things. And just to go back to what she was saying about the significant residual effects, I just remind you that I agree that there would be significant residual effects at viewpoints 1 and 11, but I've also highlighted that I consider at year 15 effects at 2, 4 and 10 would, in my opinion, remain significant at least at year 15.
Okay. Can I just pick up at this point on, in terms of conditions, and just to touch on what we've been talking about, the conditions that have been agreed between the council and the applicant. So I have a copy of that in front of me. Now, they are the deemed consent conditions. There's been obviously much discussion between parties on that, and if consent is granted, they would be the conditions that would be applied. For Section 36 cases, there will be standard Section 36 consent conditions as well. And the specimen conditions identifies 4, that's actually 5, but one of which would not be relevant here, which deals with aviation radar, but 4 that potentially could and probably need to be introduced. I just wondered to what extent they've been discussed between parties. Now, the 4 conditions that would be covered would be the duration of the consent, the commencement of development, the non-assignation, which is the kind of passing on of the consent to restrict that, and serious incident reporting. Now, if I could just ask the applicant to comment on the extent to which that has been discussed and where you might be on those matters. Are you having trouble hearing me again?
Sorry.
Okay.
Ma'am, just perhaps to confirm the position in relation to discussions with the council, there's been no discussion with the council in relation to the Section 36 consent conditions.
Okay. Do you have a view at this stage as to what the duration of the consent might be?
Ma'am, as I think we set out on Monday, it was 125 years that certainly the applicant has been working on, and that is set out in the environmental impact assessment statement.
Thank you for confirming that. And the commencement of development?
I think it would be whenever consent was granted would be the.
And the restriction would normally apply a period of around 3 years. That can vary with different consents at the agreement of the parties. 3 years from the date of consent, or a substitution. The solicitors can direct in writing if necessary.
Yeah, I think three. Perhaps, Ma'am, if I came back in my closing submission and just set out that and got confirmation, I'm being told here 3 years sounds 3. Yeah, but perhaps if we come back and confirm that.
Yeah, I'll ask the council to comment as well. Non-assignation, presumably there would be no objections to that being introduced.
Sorry, Ma'am, I lost you again there.
Sorry, the non-assignation of the consent. You can't assign it to anyone else, any other company, without prior authorisation of Scottish ministers. That's another standard consent.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. And serious incident reporting?
Again, we'd be accept the standard condition on that.
Okay. And from the council's point of view, Mr. Finlay?
I don't think we got any particular comment. I know Simon Heinsohn is, who's the planning officer who dealt with the planning report, is on the call. I don't know whether he has any particular views on that. Let me just, I note he's happy with standard conditions on non-assignation and happy with 125 years. I think he thinks 5 years would be a reasonable condition for starting.
Okay.
I've understood that correctly.
Do you want to set this up closing submissions, and then the applicant will comment on that just after it's been submitted.
So I didn't quite catch that.
So, do you want to set this? I appreciate that you may feel like I've kind of just announced this at this point. You've not had a chance to discuss this. So could you want to set this out on your closing submissions?
Yes, we'll cover those issues.
You've had the opportunity to discuss it.
Yeah.
Sorry, ma'am, we're having difficulty hearing you from this end. There seems to be a sort of background, it appears like a background noise, or sort of a low ringing noise.
I'm not sure there's anything I can do about that. I'll just switch off and switch back. Okay, I don't have anything else working or running, so can you hear me okay? Is everybody able to...
better now, yes, it's gone away in fact.
Okay, I just muted myself and came back, so maybe that just cleared it. Okay, good. I just said there that I think we'll cover this in closing submissions. So give the council an opportunity to come back, and then the applicant will come back in the 7 days after that. I just wanted to mention also decommissioning. Now, in the EIA report, there is reference to a decommissioning plan, but I've noticed in the conditions that have been suggested and agreed between the parties, there's not any mention of a decommissioning plan. Now, we are talking about a very long period here, obviously of operation, potentially, over 100 years. Is that something that the applicant was suggesting should be in the conditions and was prepared to put in, but maybe hasn't made its way into the agreed conditions?
Ma'am, the applicant would certainly be happy to have a condition setting out that there should be a decommissioning plan.
And from the council's point of view, does that sound a reasonable introduction in terms of the conditions? Is it something that had been thought about or considered?
Yes, I'm told that it's covered to a certain degree in condition 11 on construction management, but a decommissioning plan, no doubt to be produced at some stage close to the point when decommissioning is going to take place. So there'd be no point having the decommissioning plan now if you're 100 years away from decommissioning.
Yes, that would make sense. I'm just going to look at condition 11. When I read through them, I didn't feel it was adequately covered. Let me just...
I'm not suggesting it is completely covered. Okay. I'm suggesting there's something on it. We can suggest wording again for that in our closing submission, and in fact, it may be more sensible, if I can suggest, rather than dealing with it in closing submissions, for these issues to be picked up between Simon Heinsohn in particular and whoever it is on Mr. Armstrong's side in the next 7 days, so that closing submissions can deal with anything about which there is disagreement, because it may be more sensible to present you with a set of agreed conditions covering these types of matter, rather than having submissions on it.
Yes, providing the parties can agree on that, and I think that's a more kind of simpler way forward. I'm happy with that. Mr. Armstrong?
Yes, ma'am. We're happy with that. It would be Fraser Mitchell from Shoesmiths who would be dealing with that. And there is obviously condition 37, which does refer to the restoration plan.
Yes.
I mean, if we don't agree, we can then make submissions on it. But if we do agree, then hopefully we needn't say anything further.
That sounds sensible. So if parties could liaise on that and come back within 7 days. So when we say 7 days, let's say a week from today.
Just to give parties a little bit leeway, could we say a week on Monday to revert to you?
We can, yes.
Just because I know that certainly I'm in inquiry next week, not that, hopefully I won't need to have any input on it, but Clashgar is starting on Tuesday.
Yes.
It would just give us a little bit more time.
Okay, so that'll be Monday the 7th of September. Sorry, we digressed a little bit in there. It's just, it seemed an opportune time to kind of bring some of that up. Just moving on to the final question then I have, and I'm directing this really at Dr. Wimble and the council really. Is there a degree of additional mitigation that can be embedded into the design of the scheme, particularly in the early stages of the project where you've highlighted some of the concerns? Do you have some thoughts, Dr. Wimble, on what kind of mitigation could perhaps be introduced?
Yes, certainly. I mean, the main thing would be to try and introduce mitigation measures that work from year one, which would then, decrease the period of time over which significant effects might persist. And that has really got to be in the earthworks. Now, I know in I think it's the FEI, they looked at what would happen to effects and the balance of earthworks were they to drop the level of the pond by 5, 10 or 15 meters, and in each case that generated an enormous excess of fill, which in itself would be an environmental problem. So I think one would be looking at a much more refined tweak of levels and earthworks to slightly drop the pond and slightly increase the amount of mitigation earthworks, which in turn would also allow a greater area of planting mitigation that would kick in earlier in a visual sense. So also, and I think we touched upon this the other day, and this is a matter of how any future construction contract would be handled, is very detailed tree and woodland retention and augmentation plan for particularly sensitive locations. And I'm thinking of the B&Bs, the one by the head pond and the one by the tail pond in particular, that there's no chance of a contractor coming along and just chopping down the vegetation because it's there within the site, which is something that unfortunately happens more often than we'd like. The other point was to do with the lining of the head pond, but that to an extent has been answered in that, as I understand it, it won't be a stone lining that is washed by water going up and down, but will be a darker finish. Now, asphalt was mentioned, but I don't know whether it would have some form of textured finish, and I'm sure Miss Morrison could probably answer that question. So those are my thoughts on the matter, but obviously I realise in adjusting the level of the pond and the amount of earthworks, two things arise there. First of all, it's very important to maintain a balance of earthworks so that they wouldn't have to take anything off site. And well, I think that's it really, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Morrison.
Yes, in addressing Dr. Wimble's points that have come up there, as shown in the FEI and SEI, there was a lot of work done to understand the optimum amount of, or the balance really, in terms of removal of material and height and adjustments of the head pond, and the development as it is that's been put forward for the application is the one that provided that balance and ensured that we could minimize wherever possible the visibility of the head pond structure. So in response to that element, I don't think there are additional measures that can be undertaken to change that, other than to say that that it will be critical, the earthwork, the landform modifications that are achieved on the ground during construction, and would consider that condition 35, which is the appointment of a suitably qualified landscape architect through the duration of the construction and pre-construction period, to be able to advise on these forms to ensure that they are achieving their desired effect, which is to integrate the head pond into the landscape and into views. I would agree is critical in ensuring and trying to achieve that during the construction period. The other element that would enable the forest, the woodland to establish earlier, we've touched on, is ensuring that as many areas which we've identified can be undertaken in advanced planting works, so that you're establishing and providing establishment of as many areas of woodland as you can, so there's a progressive kind of transformation of their growth and the integration of the development, and that would be key in reducing the effects and trying to ensure that the woodland planting will establish as per best practice, and giving it as many years in advance as is possible to achieve. That will be detailed, or could be detailed, in condition 32, which is a forest plan, in which the phasing of the planting can be identified, along with the obviously species mixes and the densities and the plans associated with that. One point that was touched on Monday's hearing is, it's important the maintenance and management of any of this mitigation planting. There's no point putting it in if it's not going to be effectively managed and maintained. And the forestry plan will identify that management will be for the lifespan of the project, of the 125 years.
And the point about the lining of the head pond, could you just clarify the point made by Dr. Wimber?
Apologies. Yes, that will be an asphalt concrete liner. In terms of its actual texture, I'm not sure of quite the texture that Dr. Wimber was perhaps suggesting. It will certainly be dark in colour, and will, be of that formation, asphalt concrete.
Thank you. Dr. Wimble, anything further from you at this stage?
I suppose what I was asking, well, I think from that it sounds like it's going to be a smooth, dark finish and not particularly textured. And I suppose the only other point I would make is it's been my experience doing large construction projects that geological information, pre-development surveys and so on, don't necessarily match up to what happens during the construction period, and quite often designs have to change slightly, or sometimes radically, to accommodate what is actually encountered during the construction works. I can think of, for instance, the Crianlarich bypass, which ended up having to excavate a mass of rock, which they never anticipated. So while that can be an issue, it's an issue to any particular scheme, and at the same time it may also provide an opportunity to modify the mitigation measures favourably.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Morrison, do you have anything further to add?
I can just clarify actually that the liner won't be a smooth finish, that it will be rougher or with a texture, so won't be smooth, and certainly won't then be a kind of shiny, I suppose, in terms of the way light can catch it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I've reached the end of my questions and those items that I'd set out in the hearing agenda. And unless there's anything further that anyone wants to raise in terms of any kind of practical matters or any areas of clarification that they're seeking in terms of the information that I'm seeking, then I will bring the hearing to a close. Can I just check with the applicant, Mr. Armstrong, is there anything further you want to raise that hasn't been covered today?
No, ma'am, there's nothing further.
Okay. And from the council's perspective, Mr. Finlay?
No, ma'am.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for your time and your patience over the last few days. And I think the hearing went well, apart from a few little audio problems, but in the majority of the time, I think everybody could hear very well and see everybody. So thank you very much for participating. And I think this will be put onto the web probably probably Monday now, actually, rather than today. So it'll be webcast and put up next week. Thank you very much. Have a good day.